besides being a scholar and many other wonderful characteristics, you are also in charge of the Columbia Global Centers, which include Tunis and Amman. So how are you building on your understanding of Tunisia to enhance the program and the contacts between these enlightened North Africans and what we hope are enlightened Americans at Columbia and elsewhere?
Let me start maybe by talking a little bit about Arab reactions to the experiment with Tunisia. You know, Arab masses have been, I find, incredibly positive, excited about what has been happening in Tunisia. Tunisia set the stage for what was to come in Tahrir Square, in Cairo, and elsewhere in the region. What I find among Arab youth is a jealousy for Tunisia to be protected, right? And a jealousy of Tunisia because they want some of the same freedoms that that Tunisians have been bestowed upon. But they are very frustrated also because they know that many of these aims are far. Where I've tried to make a difference through the global centers and through a Tunis-Amman connection and through my own work is really working on education in Jordan. So when I went back to Jordan to establish the Global Center in Amman, I was shocked at what I had seen in society and in the education system. And you cannot, of course, separate the two because what we train our students to think and how they think, of course, carries over then to society and becomes self-enforcing. What I saw as a difference between the 1970s and late 60s when I was in school in Jordan and what I came back to in terms of the exclusionary rhetoric, in terms of the intolerance, in terms of the sympathy with jihadist type of ideologies was just incredibly scary. And you see also the overtaking of the public space by religion. The Amman I grew up in the 1960s and 1970s was a very secular, modern Amman. And when I say Amman, I mean Cairo, I mean Beirut, I mean many of the capitals of that part of the world that had a lot of promise and potential. So what I try to do and what we are interested in is when we talk about democracy and the democratic experience, it's not only electoral democracy, right? So what's more important is democracy in terms of democracy of thought, democracy of freedoms, democracy of rights. Those are the things that we are trying to work on with local NGOs, but also with government. I mean, I delivered a very similar talk to an audience in Amman where the Minister of Education was there, and we ended up having a conversation about this with me underscoring the historic role that he plays as a progressive Minister of Education being brought in to do this. So I guess in sum, I think the most important thing to be looking at as we compare experiences and we want to draw some lessons. To me, the most important one is the area of education. I'll just finish with just one anecdote, which I actually mentioned over here. So Tunisia, part of the education reform that started in 1958 is that every Tunisian student has to complete 2 years of philosophy. And that was the case in 1958, that's the case today. Philosophy is not taught as part of the curriculum anywhere in the Arab world. So when I was sitting with a friend and colleague a few months before I finished the book, and he was complaining to me about the deterioration of the quality of education in Tunisia, and it has deteriorated under Ben Ali, and I speak about that in detail over here. I said, yes, but you're far better than the rest of the Arab world. And he reminds me, as Tunisians always do, our benchmark is not the Arab world. Our benchmark is Europe. When Steve Coll, the Dean of Journalism, was in Tunis during the Casbah protests of early 2011, and he asked Tunisians who were protesting, what model of democracy do you want to copy? He expected Malaysia, Indonesia, another Muslim country. The answer was not. The answer was the UK, France, the United States, and so on. But to go back to my conversation with Yusuf about education, and I said, well, give me an example of how it has deteriorated. He said, I didn't realize until I went to college that to learn Descartes the right way was not what we were taught it. And I laughed and I said, tens of millions of Arabs graduate from school not even having heard of René Descartes. And when you don't have philosophy as part of your curriculum, when Darwinism is not taught, when you don't have the opportunity to form your own opinions. You know, you see, you got me going now, Susan. I'll stop at this. You know, there are three trends that have defined the Arab mind since independence. And again, you know, in situations like this, you oversimplify because you're trying to reduce it. You had three things that converged and conspired. Hyper-nationalism in countries that came out of nowhere, where regimes had to assert themselves and assert their rightful claim to the thrones, throne being, you know, not necessarily a monarchical throne. Hyper-nationalism, religion, which also is about absolute truths, okay? And the question of Israel-Palestine, where there is no nuance, there is no gray area. So with those three factors, you had generations of Arabs growing up with a very strict interpretation, not even an interpretation, a very strict regurgitation of what is right and what is wrong. And, you know, when you have students in Tunisia, many of them told me that even before the revolt, they would not only debate, they would protest within their schools. When you have UGTT, labor union movement, you had procedural democracy at work for a century. You had practice with those things that was going on.